Hello everyone, hope everyone is doing well. Today we're going to learn about game theory, and we are going to see how we can use the ideas of game theory to understand the behavior of oligopolies. So what is game theory? So game theory here, a definition of game theory would be it is the strategic interaction of different players in a game in order to get the best outcome. So we see game theory being played in many different cases. We see it in sports. So let's say if I'm looking at soccer or football, and if I want to play, let's say I'm making a penalty kick, and here is the goalie, um, you know, and here is the person who is going to do the penalty kick. Where is this person going to kick the ball? Is it going to be this way, or is it going to be straight to the goalie? The goalie does not know that, and so this is an example of a game theory. The goalie may use prior information as to how this player shoots the ball in order to understand which way they may shoot the ball. The goalie may think maybe the player is going to shoot to the right. Maybe the player was running this way and is planning to shoot to the right, but the goalie may know that, well, should I dive to the right or should I dive to the left? So that kind of strategic interaction can be modeled as a game theory example. We also see game theory in other sports like poker, and also we see game theory in businesses. So if I have a number of competitors, how do each of the competitors interact when something happens to one business? So let's say if a new business comes in, or if a business or a company introduces a new product, what should other businesses do? How do they strategically interact in that case? Or how do they price their products? If one business prices it in one way, what happens to the prices of the other products? So far we have talked about cases where, businesses were or profit maximizing, and so they set their price in a way so that they would maximize profits. Here, they're thinking about profit maximization, but they know that if they set a price at a certain level, they have to see what their competitors are doing in order to make sure they make the best decision. So in politics too, there's a lot of game theory involved. I mean, in cases, let's say, about campaign spending, politicians strategically allocate campaign funding. So in places where maybe they see that there's a very close race there, they may spend more compared to places where there isn't much much of a competition. The most famous example of game theory that we use is called prisoner's dilemma, and this helps us to understand where we can easily use game theory to see how it can be applied in other settings. So imagine there are two prisoners and they were caught committing a crime. So they were caught, but unfortunately, the DA, the district attorney, does not have enough evidence to put them away for the maximum sentence. So then what the DA does is, and if you see any kind of crime movies or series or anything, you will see that the prisoners are not interrogated in the same room. So the prisoners are, prisoner 1 is in one room, and prisoner 2, they are kept in separate rooms. And the DA basically asks them separately what they did and they want to confess or not. So what the DA then does is, hoping that one person will probably confess, in order to get both the prisoners' maximum sentence, so the DA needs to make at least one of the prisoners confess. So based on that evidence, they can then put both of them away. Or maybe they can make one person confess, and so as a reward, the prisoner that confessed will get a shorter sentence. Let's say that we have the game here. So then in our case with game theory, we have each prisoner, or each player in this case, or we can call player if we are talking about another game, they have strategies. So each actor in this game, they have different strategies. So the strategies for our case, for the prisoners, the two strategies are going to be either we have not confess, or we have to confess. So the player can either confess or not confess. Now, which one is the best strategy of the player? So what we need to do here is create a table. So let's look at this game now. In our case, prisoner 1, and I'm calling prisoner 1 P1 here, and prisoner 2 is P2 here. Let's say that prisoner 1 and prisoner 2 are in two separate rooms, and prisoner 1's strategies are confess or not confess. Prisoner 2 also has the same strategy. It's either to confess or not confess. Now let's say both prisoners are saying they're not guilty, so neither confesses. So if prisoner 1 does not confess and prisoner 2 does not confess, then the DA does not have enough information to put them up behind bars for long. So prisoner 1 gets 3 years and prisoner 2 gets 3 years. However, if they both end up confessing, prisoner 1 gets 9 years, prisoner 2 gets 9 years. Then it seems like the best idea for both prisoners is to not confess. Now let's look at prisoner 1. Let's say prisoner 1 is not confessing. Prisoner 2 started off at not confessing. But then the DA comes in and gives them an offer. If you confess, then prisoner 1 gets all the brunt, and you just, prisoner 2, walk out with only 1 year of prison. So for prisoner 2, if I'm prisoner 2, I look at the numbers. If I end up confessing, I get 1 year, but if I don't confess, I get 3 years. It seems like confessing seems to be a better option. So if prisoner 1 is not confessing, then for prisoner 2, it seems like a better good thing to do is to confess. Let's say, what if prisoner 1 ends up confessing? So then prisoner 2 sees that if I don't confess, then I end up getting 10 years. But if I confess, I get 9 years. If prisoner 1 confesses, then prisoner 2's best option is to end up confessing. Thus, from here we can see that no matter what prisoner 1 does, prisoner 1 may not confess. If prisoner 1 does not confess, prisoner 2, their best strategy is to end up confessing. On the other hand, if prisoner 1 confesses, then it's also the best strategy of prisoner 2 to end up confessing. So it seems like no matter what prisoner 1 does, prisoner 2 should always confess. We call this a dominant strategy. So it doesn't matter what prisoner 2 does, for prisoner 1, it's always best to confess. Now let's look at what should be the strategy of prisoner 1. We don't know, or prisoner 1 does not know what prisoner 2 is doing. So let's say prisoner 1 thinks that prisoner 2 will not confess. In that case, prisoner 1 is thinking, what should be my best strategy? If I don't confess, then I end up with 3 years. But if I confess, I can reduce my sentence by 2 years and I just serve 1 year in prison. So if prisoner 1 does not confess, it's best for if prisoner 2 does not confess, it's best for prisoner 1 to confess. On the other hand, let's say prisoner 1 thinks that prisoner 2 will end up confessing. In that case, prisoner 1 is deciding, what should I do? Should I confess or not confess? It seems like if I don't confess, then prisoner 1 gets 10 years of prison. But if prisoner 1 confesses, they get 9 years of prison. So that seems like a good deal for confessing. So no matter what prisoner 2 does, prisoner 1 also ends up confessing. So in our case, we see that both prisoners end up confessing. It's in their dominant strategy to confess to the crime, even though it would have been best for them not to confess, because if I end up confessing, both of them gets 9 years in prison. If neither confesses, both gets 3 years in prison. This seems like a better option, but there's always the possibility of defection. Prisoner 1 may defect or prisoner 2 may defect, and since they don't trust each other and there is a possibility of defect, they end up going to the confessions phase. So this is where the dilemma comes into. Now, this is what we just see. Given what prisoner 2 does or prisoner 1 does, either confess or not confess, it seems like prisoner 1 thinks their best strategy is to confess. Similarly, I can say given whatever prisoner 1 does, prisoner 2 thinks it's their best strategy is to confess. So what would we call this? We now have come up with notion of Nash equilibrium. So let's first define Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is the result of a game where each players have played their best strategy given what the other players have played. So in our case, no matter what prisoner 2 did, confess or not confess, prisoner 1's best strategy was to confess. Similarly, given whatever prisoner 1 did, prisoner 2's best strategy was to confess. So our Nash equilibrium is both prisoners end up confessing, and the dominant strategy of the both players was to confess in our case. So this is one example of prisoner's dilemma. Now, how do we kind of bring this to businesses? There is a special kind of business organizations which we call oligopolies. This is basically a market that is an oligopoly is a market dominated by few firms. And there are a few markets like that. One very famous one is video game consoles. Just 3 or 4 companies basically produce all the consoles there are in video games. We have golf balls or golf equipment. They're only produced by a few companies. So for these things, now there isn't perfect competition in these markets because basically they are able to control the prices and quantity. They are not price takers, they can be price makers. However, they're not like monopolistic competition because they don't have a ton of competitors. They are within a niche market, but that niche market has a few sellers within them. So in our case then, they're not exactly like monopolies, so they cannot independently set prices, but they're also not like perfect competition or monopolistically competitive markets because they're not price takers in the long run. They can set their prices, but their prices are set in a way based on what their competitors are doing. So let's say we have a market with 3 car companies. So we have, let's say, Toyota, Honda, and Mazda. If these are the only companies, then in perfect competition, we said that firms basically are profit maximizing, so they will look at their marginal cost and marginal revenue to figure out what the best profit maximizing output should be. Same thing with monopoly and monopolistically competitive markets. But here, what they do is that Toyota will see what is Honda and Mazda doing. Based on that, they are going to price their output. So it's not that Toyota will set price independently. They will look at what their competitors are doing and then set prices. So let's look at one example of what kind of decisions that oligopolies or firms may make. So let's say we have these 2 airlines, Dynamic Airlines and Atlantic Airlines, and they have 2 different strategies. They can either raise price or lower price. And based on what one airline does, the other airline's profits are affected. So these numbers are the profits of each airline based on what the other airlines is doing. Now let's look at an example. Let's see what is the dominant strategy of Dynamic Airlines. They cannot talk to each other. So let's say Dynamic Airlines believes that Atlantic Airlines is going to raise price. So if Atlantic Airlines is raising price, then Dynamic Airlines can either raise or lower price. If it raises price, it can see that Dynamic's profit is 8,000. However, if it lowers price, it sees that the profit goes up to 15,000. So if Atlantic Airlines is raising price, then the best strategy of Dynamic Airlines is to lower price. However, let's say that Atlantic Airlines is lowering price. This is what Dynamic Airlines thinks. Then in that case, if Dynamic Airlines raises price, they get a profit of 1,000, but if it lowers price, the profit goes up to 3,000. So then in this case too, we see that the best strategy of Dynamic Airlines is to lower price if Atlantic Airlines is also lowering price. So no matter what Atlantic Airlines does, the best strategy of Dynamic Airlines is always to lower price. Now let's look at Atlantic Airlines' strategies. Again, let's say that Atlantic Airlines does not know what Dynamic Airlines is doing. So let's say Atlantic Airlines believes that Dynamic Airlines is going to raise the price. If price is raised, then Atlantic Airlines, if they also raise prices, their profit is 8,000. But if they lower price, their profit goes up to 12,000. So it seems that Atlantic Airlines should also lower price. On the other hand, if Atlantic Airlines believes that Dynamic Airlines is going to lower the price, then it's going to compare these two strategies and see that by lowering price, they get a higher profit. So in both cases, then, we see that the best strategy of Atlantic Airlines is to also lower price. Then our Nash equilibrium ends up being this box here, where both airlines lower price and they are at this stage. Now, on the other hand, let's say that if airlines actually could collude, if Atlantic and Dynamic Airlines could collude with each other, they could keep the prices artificially high up and get a higher profit. But there is always a chance of an airlines to cheat, and then once they cheat, they end up in the lower profit equilibrium. Now, it could be the case that firms may actually work together and make sure that no one lowers prices, and that if a firm lowers prices, then they're punished. So then collusion can lead to something called a cartel, and that cartel makes sure that each of the members keep their prices at a certain level so that we can, or they can earn a lot of profits. Colluding and creating cartels in America is illegal, so if there is any evidence that companies are doing that, then the US government goes after them. Here's more formal definition of collusion. This is when businesses agree to take steps so that they can earn a higher profit by raising price or by cutting down quantity. Here we just looked at price, but maybe they could also cut quantity and raise prices. So one famous collusion or cartel is OPEC, which is a cartel of countries that collude together to maintain high prices of oil. Hopefully this was helpful in understanding game theory and oligopolies. I'll see you at a later video. Have a good day. Goodbye.